Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Before we begin today's The Hindu analysis, let me remind you that if you're liking our initiatives, please like the videos, comment on them, share your feedback, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. In this article, the writers evaluate how Indian agriculture is on the cusp of witnessing a data revolution. See, recently, two important reports were brought out with regard to Indian agriculture. One was the IDEA report, or the India Digital Ecosystem of Agriculture, by the Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare, and the other was a report brought out by a private organization known as Bain and Company. Both the reports talk about how data-driven digital revolution can disrupt Indian agriculture. The IDEA report of the Ministry of Agriculture focuses on bringing about a digital revolution in Indian agriculture, and it predicts a revolutionary investment growth in various sectors of agriculture such as agri-logistics, agricultural offtake, agri-input delivery, etc. The report anticipates that in the next 3 to 4 years, data-driven digital technology is going to disrupt Indian agriculture, thereby bringing enormous benefits to the Indian farmers. Then the report by Bain and Company is also on similar lines, and it predicts how the agri-business scenario in India could develop in the coming years, based on the harvesting of agricultural data by tech-driven agri companies and startups. See, India's agriculture sector is worth nearly $370 billion, and it is expected to receive a boost of another $35 billion in the coming years. So as private investment flows into the agri sector, and as the government is also coming out with timely agricultural reforms, including the latest farm laws which have been opposed by the farmers, the two reports predict the initiation of digital agriculture in the country by fusing agriculture-related data with innovation. We are already witnessing several agri-tech industries and startups coming up in the country and as well as around the world, which are harvesting precious data at the farm level, and they capture critical data, including soil condition, the plant varieties which are being grown, the climatic conditions, water availability, moisture level, and also includes data related to supply chain logistics and the overall consumer demand for various varieties of crops. So in this data-driven world, such ground-level data from the farms and from the agri markets and consumers is going to play a critical role in the coming days, as this precious data will be used by agri businesses to drive innovation in agriculture. The Ministry of Agriculture anticipates through the IDEA report that this upcoming digital revolution in Indian agriculture will directly drive farmers' income as well, thereby improving their livelihoods. So in the coming years, we can anticipate agri-tech to play a role all the way from the farm to our plates as they start linking the producers with the consumers. The entire supply chain and food system can be digitized, and all this data could be used to drive technology-based innovation in agriculture, which will not only help in improving agricultural productivity, but will also help in making the agri-system more efficient, thereby bringing enormous benefits to the farmers and as well as to the consumers. But however, such digitization without adequate safeguards could also be dangerous, and that's one of the reasons why the traditional IT industry is still opposed to the digitization of agriculture. Their opposition is mainly on ethical grounds, because the Ministry of Agriculture is already pushing for creating a farmers database by issuing a unique farmer identification number to each farmer based on their Aadhaar numbers. The creation of such massive digital databases without adequate data security safeguards could create enormous potential for misuse, which could not only compromise the interests of the farmers, but it could also compromise the stability of Indian agriculture. Then, of course, there is also the question of consequences of digitization of agriculture. If this digitization leads to massive scaling up of agriculture, We will have to think about its adverse consequences as well, including increased emissions, increasing resource and carbon footprint of agriculture, and as well as sustainability issues created by a rapid increase in agricultural activities. While such rapid increase in agriculture definitely presents a business opportunity, it also raises several ethical, environmental, and as well as privacy concerns. See, both the reports, that is the one brought out by the Ministry of Agriculture and the other brought out by Bain and Company, they talk about digital disruption in agriculture by bringing the farmers and the farmlands on board a digital framework, by leveraging the business opportunities being created, especially in agriculture marketing, through the recently introduced farm laws and agricultural reforms. While this definitely presents a great opportunity for agri-tech industry and startups, it does not take into account some of the genuine concerns on the ground. For example, in a country like India, most of the farmers are small and marginal farmers. These farmers are not really tech savvy and they are not well educated. They lack the required capacity and resources to be a part of such a digitized agriculture, and as a result, they might fail to reap the benefits of such agriculture. The growing digitization of our farmlands will definitely benefit the big farmers and even the big companies, as they can easily leverage the advantages of data-driven technology. They can easily scale up their farms, optimize the cost of their agri inputs such as seeds and fertilizers, and leverage the best of agri marketing technologies to drive up their profits. But the same cannot be guaranteed to small and marginal farmers who might be completely left behind, as they would lack the capacity and the resources to be a part of digital agriculture. Hence, the writers are calling upon the government and even the agri-tech industries and startups to keep this in mind and ensure that any data-centric technology is designed by keeping in mind the interests of the small and marginal farmers. If the benefits of this data revolution in agriculture has to reach the small and marginal farmers, then their capacities will have to be boosted. This could be done by roping in the farmers' producer organizations, which may have the required resources, and with adequate support from the government and the industry, they can help in building the capacities of the small and marginal farmers so that even they could truly benefit from the ongoing digitization in agriculture. Hence, the writers point out that while a data revolution and a digital revolution in Indian agriculture is welcome, technological fixes and agribusiness investments alone cannot solve all the problems that are plaguing Indian agriculture, and they solely cannot help improve the livelihoods of farmers. So the government will have to take into account the concerns that have been expressed by the farmers who are protesting against the farm laws, and even the concerns of data security will have to be factored in. And only if this digitization in agriculture is inclusive, only then will it truly benefit Indian agriculture, particularly the small and marginal farmers. Now let's look at an editorial from page number 6 that refers to the first ever anti-malaria vaccine that was recently approved by the World Health Organization. See, just a few days back, the WHO approved the first ever anti-malarial vaccine, RTSS. The editorial calls it a major scientific breakthrough because this vaccine was in the development for nearly 3 decades. The significance of this scientific development cannot be emphasized enough because this infectious disease is responsible for nearly 500,000 deaths every year, and most of the victims happen to be young children under the age of 5 years. The disease burden of malaria is disproportionately shared by African countries, especially those countries in the sub-Saharan African region. Every year, millions of cases are reported around the world, a majority of them in sub-Saharan Africa, and lakhs of children under the age of 5 years lose their lives because of this deadly disease. As you might know, malaria is an infectious disease caused by a group of parasites that belong to the Plasmodium group, and this parasite is carried by mosquitoes, which act as a vector. Amongst all the Plasmodium variants, the P. falciparum is considered to be the deadliest, and this vaccine, which has been approved by the WHO, has been specifically designed to target this particular pathogen. So the editorial remarks that the development of this vaccine and its trials and final approval is a major triumph for vaccine development and scientific development. But now the challenge lies in taking these vaccines to the field and in delivering them to the most needy and vulnerable population. After a series of pilot projects in a few African nations, the WHO and as well as the European Medical Agency have approved the usage of this vaccine, especially for children. But now the challenge lies in scaling up its production and in distributing these vaccines to the regions which need it the most. This would require a global effort where countries will have to help one another. And finally, at the grassroots, there needs to be equitable access to the vaccine so that it can truly serve its socio-economic purpose. But however, governments should also exercise caution because the introduction of the vaccine shouldn't mean the end of our fight against malaria. The vaccines will only help in reducing the severity of the disease and in preventing deaths and fatalities. The current ongoing malaria prevention activities of the government should continue, which essentially includes behavioral practices and as well as preventive measures such as the usage of mosquito nets, insecticides, measures to prevent the breeding of mosquitoes, and timely medical assistance to the victims, especially to young children. So these prevention and control strategies will have to continue while governments scale up the vaccination program, which will collectively help in the global fight against malaria. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 6, which highlights the significance of this year's Nobel Prize in Physics. See, generally physics is considered as a study or as a science of simple systems. In fact, this is often considered as a standout feature of physics, and sometimes even the subject is derided because it is just considered to be a study of simple systems. But this year's Nobel Prize in Physics has been awarded to 3 researchers who have helped us better understand complex physical systems. See, one half of the award has been given to Syukuro Manabe of Princeton University in the United States and Klaus Hasselmann of the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, Germany. These 2 researchers have been recognized for their tremendous work in the field of climate science. Their work in physics has led to better understanding of climate systems, which happen to be very complex systems, unlike the simple systems which are usually studied and evaluated in physics. Syukuro Manabe developed a model which helped us understand how the presence of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere can lead to the warming of the atmosphere. And Klaus Hasselmann, on the other hand, developed a model to understand the impact of human activities on our climate, which basically helps us understand the extent to which human footprint is driving climate change. So both these studies have been critical in our understanding of climate change and in establishing the science behind it. Developing a modeling system for global warming and climate change is no easy task because this represents a very complex physical system where there are simply too many variables, and to make sense out of this and to establish a provable theory, it would have taken enormous efforts and ingenuity on the part of these 2 researchers. Today, most of our understanding of climate change and global warming is based on the modeling studies that were brought out by these 2 researchers, and rightly, their immense contribution to the field of science, especially to the field of physics, has been recognized by the Nobel Committee by awarding them the Nobel Prize for Physics. The other half of the Nobel Prize for Physics has been shared with Giorgio Parisi, a researcher from Rome, for developing a simple model to understand the complex system known as spin glasses. This again is considered as an outstanding feat in the world of mathematics and physics because his simplification of this complex model known as the spin glasses has helped in the study of complex condensed matter systems, and his simplified model of spin glasses has led to several breakthroughs in other fields such as mathematics, biology, neuroscience, etc. For example, neuroscientists have been able to better understand as to how memory is stored in nerve cells based on the works of Giorgio Parisi, who simplified the understanding of condensed matter systems. So by recognizing these researchers, the Nobel Committee has honored their immense contribution to the field of physics and science. Next, in a column on page number 7, the writers argue that it is an imperative to make disaster resilience an inherent part of community culture in order to institutionalize disaster management at the grassroots. They emphasize that in disaster management, disaster resilience should be built at the community level, that is at the grassroots, not just to provide for effective response to disasters, but also to help the local communities prepare for the disasters by taking adequate preventive and mitigation measures. So this would essentially mean instilling disaster resilience at the level of Panchayati Raj institutions. See, in India, the first Panchayati Raj institution was formalized in 1959 in the state of Rajasthan. Ever since, the PRIs have become the backbone of decentralized governance in the country, and they have even been given constitutional status through the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act. So decentralized governance through Panchayati Raj institutions provides for a bottoms-up approach with regard to planning, resource mobilization, and as well as with regard to implementation. But in the field of disaster management, especially in the field of disaster response, the traditional governance approach is a top-down centralized approach. It was always believed that disaster management is better handled when it is centralized and when disaster response and preparedness is implemented in a top-down manner. But this understanding has been turned upside down by the COVID-19 pandemic and by the massive disruption that it has caused. The pandemic is nothing short of a disaster, and when the whole country was put on the back foot by the pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns, it was our grassroots institutions, that is the Panchayati Raj institutions and the urban local bodies in cities and urban areas, which took the lead role in our fight against the pandemic. The enormous disruption created by the pandemic rendered the response of the center and the states ineffective, and the entire burden of putting up a fight against the pandemic fell on our grassroots institutions. The writer points out that India's grassroots institutions have played a phenomenal role over the last 1.5 years in reducing the disaster risk associated with the COVID-19 pandemic by effectively implementing the COVID-19 restrictions and as well as the social distancing norms and quarantine protocols. It is the panchayats and the municipal bodies which have displayed local level leadership, not just in performing the regulatory function of enforcing the lockdowns, but they've also taken up the welfare function by delivering healthcare during both the first and the second waves of the pandemic. So this stellar role of India's decentralized institutions highlights the importance of building disaster resilience at the community level, that is at the grassroots level. Amongst the Panchayati Raj institutions, the bottommost institution is the Gram Sabha within the Gram Panchayats, and the Gram Sabhas truly provide for a platform where the local people of the community can come together to ideate and to express their opinions and to build consensus amongst the community and even to take decisions and adopt resolutions which will help in the development and upliftment of the local community. Following the pandemic, it was the Gram Sabhas which played a key role in bridging the gap and the trust deficit between the local community and the healthcare workers and the frontline workers. The Gram Sabhas worked closely with the ASHA workers and the Anganwadi centers to spread awareness about the pandemic amongst the local community. Apart from promoting awareness, they highlighted the importance of basic hygiene measures, including the need to follow social distancing, and they even cleared the stigma surrounding quarantine. Now in the vaccination program as well, the Gram Sabhas are playing an important role in assuring the local community about the safety and the efficacy of vaccines. And in short, at every stage of the pandemic, the grassroots institutions have played a critical role in India's fight against the pandemic. This performance of India's Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies is actually in line with the principles of the Yokohama Strategy on Disaster Management, which was adopted in 1994. This was the first such international conference related to disaster management, which brought out the concept of a disaster management cycle. See, prior to the Yokohama strategy, disaster management around the world was entirely focused on disaster response alone. This just included emergency relief, search and rescue, and basic immediate support to the affected victims of a disaster. But following the Yokohama strategy, a more comprehensive holistic cycle was adopted, which prioritized disaster preparedness, prevention, and mitigation. It brought the focus on reducing disaster risk and vulnerability, which later has been mainstreamed by the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. So if these globally accepted principles will have to be implemented, then the Panchayati Raj institutions and the grassroots institutions will have to play a key role, and this would require inculcating disaster resilience at the community level, which will allow us to implement a citizen-centric disaster management model in the country. Even if you look at other disasters, such as cyclones or floods, it is the response and the preparedness of the grassroots institutions which actually make a difference, and hence it's essential to promote stronger disaster management at the grassroots, and it is an imperative to make disaster resilience an inherent part of the community culture. Now let's look at these two articles from page number 8 and 11 that deal with the current situation in Afghanistan. India has expressed deep concern about rising incidents of intolerance and vandalism in Afghanistan. It has been reported that Taliban vigilantes have attacked a Gurudwara in Kabul, and there is the growing threat of religious intolerance by the fundamentalist group against the religious minorities. In this context, India's representative at the UN Security Council has reminded the Taliban of its obligations under the UNSC 2593 resolution, which was recently adopted by the UN Security Council when India was holding the presidency of the UN Security Council in the month of August. This resolution of the UNSC expects the Taliban to form an inclusive government and to foster freedom and diversity and to protect and uphold the rights of the religious and ethnic minorities in the country. But the growing incidents of vandalism, intolerance, and fundamentalism have raised concerns regarding the well-being of religious and ethnic minorities, and hence India has reminded the Taliban of its obligations under the UNSC 2593 resolution. Then in another article, it has been reported that Russia is inviting Taliban to talks along with other concerned stakeholders in order to stabilize the situation in the country. Earlier, Russia had even hosted an international conference on Afghanistan, which included participation from the US, China, and Pakistan. And even then, Taliban representatives were allowed to take part in the Moscow conference in order to work out the political future of Afghanistan. But now that the Taliban has taken over, Russia perceives a greater threat, particularly in Central Asia, from the fundamentalist group, because as it harbors fundamentalism and extremism, it could result in a spillover of terrorism into Central Asia and into the former Soviet Union republics, which directly threatens the interests of Russia. So in order to protect its core interests, Russia is already working with Central Asian countries to limit the impact of destabilization in Afghanistan, and in a few days, it is also going to host talks with the Taliban leadership, along with other concerned regional stakeholders, in order to discuss the political future of Afghanistan. As of now, India has not been invited by Russia for these talks, but India is definitely going to watch these developments very closely. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: Indian agriculture is in need of a data revolution, but technological fixes and agribusiness investments alone will not be enough to improve farmers' livelihoods. Critically examine. The second question: the malaria vaccine must see speedy implementation from the lab to the field. Comment. Kindly write your answers to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.